Sometimes a father's love makes him do things the world calls foolish. When you've lost everything and your child hasn't spoken a word since his mother died, you'll take any chance at hope, even if it means buying a haunted mansion for $1. Graham. Wilder knew the townspeople were laughing at him. Everyone said Marrowgate House was cursed, that families who lived there disappeared or went mad. But all Graham saw was a roof over his son's head, and maybe, just maybe, a place where 12-year-old Caleb might find his voice again. What Graham didn't know was that the mansion held a secret worth $10 million, buried for over a century, by greed and injustice. But what happens when the ghost haunting their new home isn't trying to drive them away, but desperately trying to show them the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cramped one-bedroom apartment that Graham Wilder called home, though the word felt hollow in his mouth these days. Home had died with Sarah 3 years ago, leaving behind only the echo of her laughter in rooms that now felt too small and too quiet. He stood at the kitchenette counter, methodically preparing 2 bowls of oatmeal, one with cinnamon the way Caleb used to like it, one plain for himself because taste had become an afterthought. Caleb sat at their second-hand table, a thin boy of 12, with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady hands. He moved his spoon through the oatmeal without eating, creating small whirlpools that reminded Graham of the way Sarah used to stir her coffee, round and round while she planned. Their days together. The boy hadn't spoken since the funeral, though the doctors assured Graham this was normal, that grief moved through children differently, that patience was the only medicine for a heart learning to beat without its other half. Graham's workbench dominated the living room, a sturdy oak surface scarred by years of honest labor. Hand tools hung in precise rows above it. Chisels, planes, sanders, each one positioned exactly where his father had taught him to keep them 30 years ago. A craftsman respects his tools, the old man used to say, because tools that are cared for will care for you in return. The philosophy had served Graham well through 2 decades of furniture restoration, custom carpentry, and the kind of detailed work that required both skill and soul. But skilled hands couldn't compete with mass production and factory efficiency. Orders had dwindled over the past year as customers chose cheaper alternatives, and now Graham's savings, what little Sarah's medical bills hadn't consumed, sat in an envelope beneath the sugar canister, thin as tissue paper and twice as fragile. Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked on the door with her characteristic 3-tap pattern, the sound as familiar as morning coffee. At 78, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate a world that no longer made room for taking time. Her silver hair was always perfectly arranged, and she wore the kind of house dresses that spoke of an era when neighbors knew each other's troubles without needing to ask. "Morning, Graham," she said, stepping inside with a casserole dish that smelled of comfort and care. "Thought you and Caleb might enjoy some of my tuna noodle casserole." Graham accepted the dish with genuine gratitude. Mrs. Henderson had been bringing meals twice a week since Sarah's death, never making it feel like charity, always presenting it as simple neighborliness. She had a gift for that kind of grace. "You're too good to us, Mrs. H," Graham said, setting the dish on the counter. She waved away his thanks and moved toward Caleb, who looked up from his untouched breakfast with eyes that held too much understanding for a 12-year-old face. Mrs. Henderson had raised 4 children of her own, buried a husband after 52 years of marriage, and possessed the kind of wisdom that came from weathering life's storms without losing faith in sunny days. "How are you this morning, sweet boy?" she asked Caleb, her voice soft as flannel. Caleb nodded once, a small acknowledgement that had become his primary form of communication. She touched his shoulder gently, the way Sarah used to do, and Graham felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the physical manifestation of missing someone so deeply that breathing became a conscious effort. "Graham, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you look like you haven't been sleeping," Mrs. Henderson observed, her sharp eyes taking in the circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that came from too much coffee and too little rest. He couldn't deny it. Sleep had become elusive, filled with dreams of unpaid bills and uncertain futures, of Caleb retreating further into silence while Graham scrambled to hold their small world together. "Just working through some things," he said, which was both entirely true and completely inadequate. Mrs. Henderson studied him with the penetrating gaze of someone who had raised teenagers and could spot a half-truth from across the county. "Sometimes working through things means accepting help when it comes along," she said, "even if that help comes in unexpected packages." Before Graham could ask what she meant, another knock echoed through the apartment. This one was different, businesslike, confident, with an underlying rhythm that suggested someone accustomed to getting answers when they asked questions. Graham opened the door to find Tommy Burke standing in the hallway, his expensive suit looking out of place in the worn corridor. Tommy was one of those men who seemed to collect money the way other people collected memories, effortlessly and without much thought for the process. He owned half the commercial real estate in town and had his fingers in more pies than the local bakery. "Graham, good morning," Tommy said, his smile practiced and perfectly calibrated. "Hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I have something that might interest you." Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow at Tommy's presence, but didn't comment, though Graham could practically hear the gears turning in her mind. Tommy Burke didn't make house calls to struggling handymen unless there was something in it for him. "Come in, I suppose," Graham said, curiosity overriding caution. Tommy entered with the confidence of someone who owned whatever room he walked into, his eyes quickly cataloguing the modest apartment, the workbench, the careful way Graham and Caleb lived their lives. His gaze lingered on Caleb for a moment, and Graham saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "Beautiful boy," Tommy said. "He has his mother's eyes." The comment caught Graham off guard. Tommy. Burke and Sarah had moved in different circles entirely, and Graham couldn't remember them ever meeting. But grief had a way of making everything feel disconnected, as if the world had continued spinning while he remained frozen in place. "What can I do for you, Tommy?" Graham asked. Tommy reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents and sealed with red wax that looked far too formal for anything Graham might be involved with. The envelope seemed to carry weight beyond its physical presence, as if it contained possibilities rather than mere papers. "I have an opportunity," Tommy said, setting the envelope on Graham's workbench with the reverence usually reserved for fragile things. "A property that needs the right kind of attention, the kind that requires skilled hands and a willingness to see potential where others see problems." Graham felt a familiar wariness creeping up his spine. In his experience, opportunities that seemed too good to be true usually were exactly that. Too good to be true. But Mrs. Henderson leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued, and Caleb had stopped stirring his oatmeal to watch the conversation unfold. "What kind of property?" Graham asked. "Marrowgate House," Tommy said simply, and the words seemed to suck the air from the room. Mrs. Henderson drew in a sharp breath. Even Caleb looked up, his eyes widening with something that might have been recognition. Everyone in town knew about Marrowgate House, the grand Victorian mansion that sat like a wounded giant on the hill overlooking the forest. It had been empty for decades, its windows dark, its grounds overgrown, its reputation steeped in whispers and warnings. "That place has been abandoned for 40 years, Graham said carefully. "Exactly," Tommy replied, his smile never wavering. "Which means it's been waiting for the right person to bring it back to life. Someone who understands the value of restoration, who appreciates craftsmanship, who isn't afraid of a little hard work." Graham knew there had to be more to the story. Properties like Marrowgate House didn't simply become available, especially not to struggling handymen with more bills than prospects. "What's the catch, Tommy?" Tommy opened the envelope and spread several documents across the workbench. Deed transfers, property surveys, legal papers that looked official and intimidating. At the center of it all was a single sheet of paper that made Graham's breath catch in his throat. Purchase price $1, Tommy said. Cash on delivery. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Graham stared at the papers, trying to process what he was seeing. Marrowgate House was easily the largest private residence in the county, sitting on 20 acres of prime land. Even in its current condition, it should have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "This is some kind of joke," Graham said finally. "No joke," Tommy assured him. "The property has been tied up in legal complications for years. The last owner died intestate, no heirs could be located, and the county has been looking for someone willing to take on the restoration responsibilities. The house is structurally sound, but needs extensive work. The right person could turn it into something magnificent." Mrs. Henderson moved closer to examine the documents, her expression thoughtful. "What aren't you telling him, Tommy Burke?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had heard enough sales pitches to recognize when crucial details were being omitted. Tommy's smile faltered slightly, the first crack in his polished presentation. "There are stories about the place," he admitted. "Local folklore, really. Some people think it's haunted." "Some people," Mrs. Henderson pressed. "Most people," Tommy conceded. "The Hendricks family lived there in the 70s. They lasted 3 months before they packed up and left in the middle of the night. Said the house was trying to drive them out. Doors slamming, cold spots, voices in the walls. The Williamses tried it in the 80s. 6 weeks. Same story." Graham felt his practical nature reasserting itself. "And you think I'm desperate enough to move my son into a house that scares people away?" But even as he asked the question, he found himself studying the property survey, noting the acreage, the proximity to good schools, the workshop space in the converted carriage house. A place where Caleb could run and explore, where Graham could build a proper workshop, where they could start fresh without the weight of old memories pressing down on them every morning. "I think you're a man who understands that houses are just wood and stone and glass," Tommy said quietly. "I think you know that the only real ghosts are the ones we carry with us, and sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what a family needs to start healing." The words hit closer to home than Graham cared to admit. He looked at Caleb, who was watching the conversation with an intensity that had been missing from his eyes for months. For the first time since Sarah's death, his son seemed genuinely interested in something happening around him. "Can I think about it?" Graham asked. "Of course," Tommy said, gathering the papers back into the envelope but leaving the deed transfer on the workbench. "But don't think too long. This kind of opportunity doesn't come around often, and I have other interested parties." After Tommy left, Mrs. Henderson lingered, her eyes fixed on the deed transfer. "That man's never done anything in his life without expecting something in return," she said thoughtfully. "You think it's a trap?" She considered this carefully, weighing her words like ingredients in a recipe. "I think it's an opportunity," she said finally. "But opportunities and traps can look remarkably similar until you're standing in the middle of them." Graham picked up the deed transfer, feeling the weight of decision pressing against his chest. The paper was thick, official, legal, real, and at the bottom, in bold black numbers, the purchase price stared back at him. $1.0. Caleb approached the workbench, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet. He reached out tentatively and touched the corner of the deed, his fingers tracing the ornate border as if he were reading something written in a language only he could understand. "What do you think, buddy?" Graham asked softly. "Should we take a look at this house?" For just a moment, Graham could have sworn he saw Caleb nod. The morning Graham and Caleb first laid eyes on Marrowgate House, fog clung to the valley like a grey shroud, making the mansion appear to float above the earth. Graham pulled his battered pickup truck to a stop at the rusted iron gates, their ornate scrollwork still elegant despite decades of neglect. Through the gaps in the metalwork, a winding gravel drive disappeared into a tunnel of overgrown oak trees, their branches forming a cathedral arch that seemed to beckon and warn in equal measure. Caleb pressed his face to the passenger window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared up at the house that would either save them or swallow them whole. The mansion rose from the mist like something from a half-remembered dream. 3 stories of weathered Victorian grandeur, complete, with turrets, bay windows, and gingerbread trim that had once been painted white, but now wore the pale grey of weathered bone. "Well," Graham said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there she is." The iron gate stood slightly ajar, as if expecting their arrival. Graham climbed out of the truck to examine the heavy brass lock, noting the craftsmanship even as rust flaked away under his fingers. The mechanism was solid, well-made, the kind of hardware they didn't manufacture anymore. With effort, he managed to swing the gates wide enough for the truck to pass through. As they drove up the winding drive, Graham felt the weight of the house's presence settling over them. The oaks on either side were ancient, their trunks thick as small buildings, their roots pushing up through the gravel in places to create a surface that made the truck bounce and sway. Spanish moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out a harsh warning that echoed through the trees. The circular drive brought them to the mansion's front entrance, where a grand portico, supported by white columns, provided shelter for the massive oak door. Graham parked and sat for a moment, studying the house's facade. Despite decades of abandonment, the structure appeared remarkably sound. The roof showed no obvious signs of damage. The windows were intact, though dark with grime, and the foundation, stones, sat level and true. Tommy Burke had given him 3 keys, an ornate brass skeleton key for the front door, a smaller silver key for interior locks, and a 3rd key whose purpose remained mysterious. Graham fingered the brass key, feeling its substantial weight. The metal was warm, despite the cool morning air, and he could have sworn he felt a slight vibration through the shaft, as if the key itself were eager to fulfill its purpose. Caleb climbed out of the truck without being asked. Something that hadn't happened since before Sarah's death. He moved toward the house with a curious lack of fear, his sneakers crunching softly on the gravel. Graham followed, noting how the boy's posture had changed, straighter, more alert, as if something in this place had awakened a part of him that had been sleeping. The front door was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, solid oak, carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. The brass doorknob was tarnished but intact, and when Graham inserted the skeleton key, the lock turned with surprising ease. The heavy door swung inward, with only the faintest protest from hinges that hadn't moved. In decades, the foyer took Graham's breath away. A grand staircase swept upward in an elegant curve, its mahogany banister gleaming despite the dust that coated everything else. Sunlight filtered through a stained glass window on the landing, casting jeweled patterns across the hardwood floor. The ceiling soared 20 feet overhead, decorated with plasterwork so intricate it belonged in a museum. "Jesus," Graham whispered, then caught himself. "Sorry, buddy, this is incredible." Caleb moved into the foyer with the confidence of someone returning home after a long journey. He walked to the base of the staircase and placed his small hand on the newel post, a carved wooden sphere topped with an elegant finial. As his fingers made contact with the wood, Graham could have sworn he heard something, a sound like a sigh, or perhaps just the old house settling. They explored the ground floor together, moving from room to room in wonder. The parlor featured a fireplace surrounded by marble carved with cherubs and roses. The dining room boasted built-in china cabinets with glass doors that reflected their images like ghostly doubles. The kitchen, while clearly from another era, showed signs of quality. Construction, solid countertops, deep sinks, and a pantry large enough to serve as a small bedroom. It was in the library that they encountered their first true strangeness. The room was lined floor to ceiling with empty bookshelves, their wood dark with age but perfectly preserved. As Graham and Caleb stood in the doorway, a book fell from one of the higher shelves, landing open on the Persian rug with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Graham approached the book cautiously, noting that the shelf it had fallen from appeared completely bare. The volume was bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age. The text was handwritten in elegant script, but the words seemed to shift and blur when he tried to read them, as if written in a language that existed just beyond his understanding. Caleb knelt beside him and pointed to an illustration on the open page, a detailed drawing of the house itself, but showing rooms and passages that Graham hadn't seen in their exploration. The boy traced the lines with his finger, following corridors that seemed to exist behind the walls they had walked past. "What do you see, Caleb?" Graham asked softly. His son looked up at him, and for a moment Graham thought he might speak. Instead, Caleb closed the book and carried it to one of the empty shelves, sliding it into place as if it belonged there. As soon as he released it, the book seemed to shimmer and fade, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Graham felt the hair on his arms stand up as an invisible presence moved past them, rustling papers that weren't there and stirring dust motes into spiraling patterns. "We should go," Graham said, but Caleb shook his head firmly. Instead of showing fear, the boy seemed energized by the supernatural encounter. He moved to the window and pressed his hands against the glass, staring out at the overgrown gardens as if he could see something Graham couldn't. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the true scope of the property. The grounds stretched in all directions, dotted with outbuildings and ornamental gardens that had long since returned to wildness. A carriage house sat at the end of a tree-lined path, its large doors perfect for the workshop Graham had always dreamed of. Beyond that, the forest pressed close, its trees ancient and thick, creating shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. As they prepared to leave, Graham noticed that the front door key felt different in his hand, lighter somehow, as if it had given up some essential part of itself. The brass metal had taken on a warmer tone, and the intricate scrollwork seemed more detailed than he remembered. The drive back to their apartment passed in contemplative silence. Caleb stared out the window, occasionally sketching invisible patterns on the fogged glass. Graham's mind raced with possibilities and concerns in equal measure. The house was magnificent, far beyond anything he could have hoped to afford through conventional means. The workmanship was extraordinary, the bones of the structure solid and true, but there had been something else in those rooms, a presence that was neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply aware. The house had been watching them, evaluating them, perhaps even testing them, and somehow they had passed whatever criteria it applied. That evening, as Caleb worked quietly on a sketch pad at their small table, Graham found himself turning the brass key over and over in his hands. The metal seemed to pulse with warmth, and he could feel tiny vibrations running through the shaft, as if the key were alive and eager to return to its purpose. Mrs. Henderson knocked on the door with her evening offering of leftover pot roast, and Graham found himself telling her about their visit to Marrowgate House. She listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told completely before they could be properly evaluated. "And what did young Caleb think of the place?" she asked. Graham glanced at his son, who was still drawing with intense concentration. "I think he liked it. More than liked it, actually. He seemed, I don't know how to explain it, he seemed like himself again." Mrs. Henderson nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. Sometimes a place calls to people. Sometimes what others see as haunted, the right family sees as home. Later that night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Graham sat at his workbench and spread out the property documents again. The deed transfer stared back at him with its impossible $1 purchase price, and beside it lay the brass key that seemed to grow warmer with each passing hour. In his pocket, Sarah's wedding ring rested against his chest on a chain he'd worn since her funeral. He touched it through his shirt, feeling its familiar weight, and for the first time in 3 years, he thought he knew what she would tell him to do. Some chances came disguised as impossibilities, some homes called to the families that needed them most, and sometimes the ghosts that haunted a place weren't trying to drive people away. They were waiting for the right people to arrive. Graham signed the deed transfer on a Tuesday morning in Tommy Burke's downtown office, his signature looking small and uncertain next to the official seals and legal language. The dollar bill he placed on Tommy's mahogany desk seemed absurdly inadequate payment for 20 acres and a mansion, but Tommy accepted it with the solemnity of a much larger transaction. "Congratulations," Tommy said, shaking Graham's hand with enthusiasm that felt slightly forced. "You're now the proud owner of Marrowgate House. I've taken the liberty of having the utilities connected. Water, electricity, gas. Consider it a housewarming gift." Within a week, Graham and Caleb had packed their few belongings into the pickup truck and made the move permanent. Mrs. Henderson stood in the apartment doorway as they loaded the last of their possessions, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You take care of that boy," she told Graham, pressing a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches into his hands. "And you take care of yourself. That house has been waiting for the right family. I can feel it in my bones." The moving process revealed how little they truly owned: clothes, Graham's tools, a few pieces of furniture, and a box of Sarah's things that neither of them could bear to look through yet. Everything fit easily in the truck, with room to spare for the groceries and supplies they'd need for their first week in the mansion. As they pulled up the gravel drive for the second time, the house seemed different in the afternoon light. More welcoming, perhaps. Or maybe Graham was simply seeing it through the eyes of ownership rather than possibility. The windows that had appeared dark and forbidding during their first visit now caught the sunlight and threw it back in warm, golden reflections. Graham had spent hours studying the original architectural plans he'd found in Tommy's files, blueprints that dated back to the house's construction in 1895. The plans revealed a structure built with obsessive attention to detail, hidden passages between walls, a complex system of pulleys and dumbwaiters, and room dimensions that seemed to shift depending on which set of drawings he consulted. The master blueprint, drawn on heavy vellum and signed by someone with the initials E.T., showed features that didn't match the other plans: secret panels, concealed staircases, and rooms that appeared on no other document. Graham assumed these were either the architect's flights of fancy or modifications that were never actually built. He was wrong. On their third day in the house, while Graham worked to repair a section of loose floorboards in the dining room, Caleb discovered the first hidden passage. The boy had been exploring with the methodical thoroughness of someone who intended to know every inch of his new home, when he noticed that the wallpaper in the hallway didn't quite align properly near the base of the stairs. Pressing against what appeared to be solid wall, Caleb felt a section give way under his touch. A narrow panel swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a passage just wide enough for a small person to navigate. The boy looked back toward the dining room where Graham was working, seemed to consider calling for his father, then stepped into the darkness alone. The passage ran parallel to the main hallway, lit by thin shafts of daylight that filtered through cleverly concealed gaps in the exterior wall. Caleb followed it for perhaps 30 feet before it opened into a small, circular room that didn't appear on any of the floor plans Graham had shown him. The room was furnished with a child's desk and chair, both sized for someone about Caleb's age. On the desk sat an inkwell, a fountain pen, and several sheets of paper covered with mathematical equations so complex they looked more like art than arithmetic. The handwriting was careful and precise, suggesting someone young but exceptionally intelligent. Caleb touched the pen, and it felt warm under his fingers, as if someone had been using it moments before. The ink in the well was still liquid, a deep blue-black that seemed to shimmer with its own light. Without quite understanding why, he picked up the pen and added his own name at the bottom of one of the mathematical worksheets. Caleb Wilder, age 12. As soon as he finished writing, the other handwriting on the page seemed to shimmer and change, rearranging itself into a new message. "Welcome, Caleb. I've been waiting for someone who could see." The boy's heart hammered in his chest, but he felt no fear. Instead, he experienced something he hadn't felt since before his mother's death, a sense of connection, of belonging, of being understood. He wrote carefully below the new message, "Who are you?" The response came immediately, the ink flowing across the page as if guided by an invisible hand. "My name was Marcus. I lived here a long time ago. I was 12 when I had to leave." Caleb stared at the words, processing their implications. The handwriting was definitely that of a child, but a child from another era. The carefully formed letters spoke of a time when penmanship was taught as an essential skill. "Why did you have to leave?" he wrote. "They said the house was haunted. They were wrong. The house was protecting me. It's protecting you, too." Before Caleb could write another question, he heard his father calling his name from somewhere in the main part of the house. The urgency in Graham's voice suggested he'd discovered the open passage and was worried about his son's whereabouts. Caleb quickly capped the pen and placed it back on the desk, but as he turned to leave, the papers on the desk began to glow with a soft, warm light. When he reached the passage entrance, Graham was there waiting, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Caleb, thank God, I saw the wall panel open," and he stopped, noticing the expression on his son's face. For the first time in 3 years, Caleb looked genuinely happy. "What did you find in there?" Graham asked gently. Caleb took his father's hand and led him back through the passage to the circular room. But when they arrived, the space was empty. No desk, no chair, no papers covered with equations. Just a small circular room with windows that looked out over the overgrown gardens. Graham knelt to examine the floor where Caleb insisted the furniture had been. The hardwood showed slight indentations consistent with the legs of a desk and chair, but the marks looked decades old. He ran his fingers over the worn spots, noting the precision with which the furniture had been positioned to take advantage of the natural light from the windows. "Someone used to study here," Graham said thoughtfully, "a long time ago." Caleb nodded vigorously, then tugged on his father's sleeve and led him to one of the windows. Pressing his face against the glass, he pointed toward a section of the garden, where the overgrowth was less dense. Graham could make out the remains of what had once been a formal maze, its hedgerows now wild and unruly, but still forming recognizable patterns. As they stood there together, father and son looking out over their new domain, Graham felt something shift in the house around them. The walls seemed to settle with a sound like a satisfied sigh, and the afternoon light streaming through the windows took on a warmer, more golden quality. That evening, as Graham worked by lamplight to repair a section of crown molding in the parlor, he found himself thinking about the hidden room and the evidence of a child who had once lived in the house. The mystery intrigued him, but more importantly, he recognized the change in Caleb. His son was exploring, investigating, showing curiosity about their new home in a way he hadn't shown interest in anything for 3 years. Whatever secrets Marrowgate house held, they were bringing his boy back to life. And for that alone, Graham would face whatever ghosts or mysteries the mansion chose to reveal. It was Caleb who found the portrait 3 weeks after they'd moved into Marrowgate House. Graham was in the kitchen, wrestling with a century-old cast-iron stove that seemed determined to resist all attempts at repair, when he heard his son's footsteps running down the main staircase with unusual urgency. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes bright with discovery, gesturing for Graham to follow him. The boy had developed a system of communication that relied heavily on pointing, pulling, and the occasional frustrated sigh when Graham failed to understand his meaning quickly enough. This time, however, his intent was clear. He wanted Graham to see something upstairs, and it couldn't wait. They climbed to the second floor, past the master bedroom they'd been slowly making habitable, and down a hallway lined with empty picture frames. The frames themselves were works of art, ornate golden affairs with hand-carved details that spoke of an era when such craftsmanship was standard rather than exceptional. Caleb led Graham to what had once been a guest bedroom, now empty except for dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. The boy walked directly to the far wall and pressed against what appeared to be solid paneling. A section of the wall swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow alcove that had been sealed behind false paneling. Inside the alcove hung a portrait that took Graham's breath away. The painting showed a man in his 30s, dressed in the formal attire of the late Victorian era. A well-tailored black suit, starched white shirt, and silk tie. But it was the man's face that commanded attention. Intelligent dark eyes gazed out from the canvas with an expression of quiet dignity and unmistakable sadness. His skin was the rich brown of polished mahogany, and his features spoke of both African heritage and profound education. The painting was a masterpiece, executed with a skill that belonged in a major museum. Every detail was rendered with loving precision, from the way light caught the gold watch chain across the man's vest to the subtle shadows that gave depth to his thoughtful expression. A small brass nameplate at the bottom of the frame read, Ezekiel Thorne, 1867-1923. Graham stared at the portrait, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew about the house's history. Tommy Burke had mentioned previous owners, but had been vague about details. The mansion's grandeur suggested wealth, but in 1895, for a black man to own such a property would have been extraordinary. "Who was he, Buddy?" Graham murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. Caleb moved closer to the portrait, studying the painted face with the intensity he usually reserved for his mathematical sketches. Then he did something that surprised his father. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper covered with the complex equations he'd been drawing since they moved into the house. Holding the paper up next to the portrait, Caleb pointed back and forth between the handwriting on his sketch and something in the painting that Graham couldn't immediately identify. Looking closer, Graham noticed that the painted man's hands rested on an open book, and the visible pages were covered with mathematical notations that bore a striking resemblance to the equations Caleb had been producing. "The same handwriting," Graham said, understanding flooding through him. "You think this man wrote the equations you've been finding?" Caleb nodded emphatically, then tugged on Graham's shirt and led him out of the room. They made their way to the small circular study Caleb had discovered, the one that sometimes contained furniture and sometimes didn't. Today it was furnished. Again, the child's desk and chair present, along with papers covered in those intricate mathematical formulas. But this time, Graham could see additional details he'd missed before. The papers weren't just covered with equations. They included detailed diagrams of mechanical devices, architectural drawings of the house itself, and what appeared to be financial calculations of staggering complexity. On the desk sat a leather-bound, a journal, its pages filled with the same careful handwriting. Graham opened it carefully, noting that the entries were dated from 1920 to 1923. As he read, a remarkable story began to emerge. Ezekiel Thorne had been far more than just the owner of a grand house. According to his journal entries, he was a self-taught mathematician, engineer, and financier who had developed revolutionary methods for predicting market trends and calculating compound returns. His financial innovations had made him wealthy, beyond imagination, but his race had made him a target in a society that couldn't accept a black man achieving such success. The journal spoke of increasing isolation, of business partners who stole his ideas and claimed them as their own, of threats from those who believed he had grown too big for his place. Thorne had retreated to Marrowgate House, continuing his work in secret while the outside world forgot he existed. Agnes paled as she recognized him. "Marcus Webb," she said. "He works for Blackstone Industries. They've been buying up property throughout the county for the past 5 years. What do they want with old houses?" Graham asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't be good. Development, shopping centers, housing subdivisions, commercial properties. They buy historical properties and tear them down to build whatever will generate the highest profit margins. The knock on the front door was polite, but insistent. Graham left Agnes and Caleb in the workshop and walked through the house to answer it, noting that the mansion itself seemed to be reacting to the visitor's presence. Doors that had been open swung shut with soft clicks. Windows that had been bright grew darker, as if clouds had moved across the sun, and the temperature dropped several degrees. Marcus Webb stood on the portico with 5 associates, all of them examining the mansion's exterior with the calculating gaze of people estimating demolition costs. Webb himself was perhaps 50, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Graham made in a month. "Mr. Wilder," Webb said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as artificial. "I'm Marcus Webb with Blackstone Industries. I understand you recently acquired this property." "That's right," Graham replied, instinctively disliking the man's presumptuous tone. "I'll be direct, Mr. Wilder. This house sits on some of the most valuable undeveloped land in the county. My company is prepared to make you an offer that would solve any financial concerns you might have." Webb handed Graham a business card along with a folder containing what appeared to be a purchase agreement. The offer amount made Graham's breath. A catch. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to secure Caleb's future and provide the kind of stability they'd lost when Sarah died. "That's a generous offer," Graham admitted, "but the house isn't for sale." Webb's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Wilder, I don't think you understand the situation. This property has been abandoned for decades. The county has been looking for ways to bring it back into productive use. There are zoning issues, historical preservation requirements, and environmental concerns that could make renovation prohibitively expensive." "Are you threatening me?" Graham asked quietly. "Not at all," Webb replied, his tone remaining pleasant, while his eyes grew cold. "I'm simply pointing out the realities of property ownership in a changing market. Sometimes the most prudent course is to accept a reasonable offer rather than risk losing everything to circumstances beyond your control." From inside the house came the sound of the mechanical calculator's gears spinning at high speed, the noise loud enough to be heard through the closed doors. Webb and his associates exchanged glances, their professional composure slipping slightly. "What was that?" one of the associates asked. "Old house," Graham said with a shrug. "Lots of strange noises. Some people say it's haunted." Webb's smile returned, but it looked more forced than before. "Mr. Wilder, I'll leave this offer with you to consider, but I should mention that Blackstone Industries has considerable influence in this county. We've found that property owners who work with us tend to have fewer complications with permits, inspections, and local regulations." After they left, Graham found Agnes and Caleb still in the workshop, both of them staring at the mechanical calculator. The device had produced a strip of paper covered with calculations, and Agnes was studying the numbers with growing alarm. "These are population projections," she said. "Economic impact assessments, environmental studies. It's like the machine calculated exactly what Blackstone Industries would do if they acquired this property." The final line of calculations was particularly disturbing. Projected completion date for a shopping mall, estimated destruction date for the mansion, and a casualty assessment that suggested the development would destroy not just the house, but the entire ecosystem of the surrounding forest. As they watched, new numbers appeared in the calculator's display windows. Coordinates, Graham realized, showing the precise locations of other properties Blackstone had acquired and developed. The pattern was clear. They were systematically acquiring historical properties throughout the region, erasing the past to make way for profitable but soulless development. "He's warning us," Graham said, understanding filling him with cold certainty. "Ezekiel is trying to tell us what they'll do if we let them have this place." The calculator's mechanism slowed and finally stopped, but the message was clear. They weren't just fighting for their home. They were fighting to preserve something far more important than any of them had realized. The encrypted journal surfaced 3 days after Marcus Webb's visit, hidden behind a false back in Ezekiel's desk drawer. Caleb discovered it while helping his father install new locks throughout the house, a precaution that had seemed wise after their encounter with Blackstone Industries. The journal was bound in black leather, worn smooth by handling, its pages filled with text that looked like gibberish at first glance. Letters and numbers were arranged in patterns that suggested meaning but revealed nothing to casual inspection. Graham recognized it as some form of code, though far more sophisticated than any cipher he'd encountered. Agnes arrived that afternoon with additional research materials and immediately recognized the significance of Caleb's discovery. She'd heard references to Thorne's private journal in other documents, but had never been able to locate the actual volume. "He was brilliant," Agnes said, studying the coded pages with academic fascination. "But he was also careful. Living as a successful black man in the 1920s required extraordinary discretion. He would never have recorded his most important thoughts and discoveries without some form of protection." Caleb, who had been watching their examination of the journal with intense interest, suddenly reached for a pencil and began sketching on a piece of paper. His drawings had grown increasingly complex since they'd moved into the house, incorporating mathematical symbols and geometric patterns that seemed beyond his years. This time, however, he was drawing something different, a grid system with numbers and letters arranged in specific patterns. "What are you working on, buddy?" Graham asked. Instead of his usual silent response, Caleb showed them his sketch and pointed to similar patterns in the journal's coded text. His drawing revealed what appeared to be a substitution cipher, but one based on mathematical relationships rather than simple letter replacement. Agnes leaned forward, studying Caleb's work with growing excitement. "He's found the key," she whispered. "Look. The numbers in his grid correspond to the spacing patterns in the journal text. Working together, they began the painstaking process of decoding Thorne's journal." Caleb seemed to understand the cipher intuitively, his fingers tracing patterns in the text while his father and Agnes transcribed the decoded messages. What emerged was a remarkable record of genius operating in isolation. The early entries, dated from 1920, described Thorne's growing success in predicting market trends using mathematical models of unprecedented sophistication. He had developed algorithms that could analyze economic data and forecast changes with accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. His wealth had grown exponentially as he applied these methods to his own investments. But success had brought unwanted attention. Later entries spoke of business associates who questioned how a black man could achieve such financial insight, of competitors who accused him of using insider information, and of increasingly direct threats from those who believed he had overstepped societal boundaries. The journal revealed that Thorne had begun hiding his assets, converting his wealth into portable forms, and concealing evidence of his most important discoveries. He had designed Marrowgate House not just as a home, but as a repository, with hidden chambers and secret passages designed to protect his life's work. One entry from 1922 was particularly chilling. "They came again today, demanding to know my methods. Henderson from the bank, Morrison from the sheriff's office, and 3 men I didn't recognize. They claim I'm manipulating the markets, disrupting the natural order, as if there were anything natural about their assumption that intelligence is distributed according to skin color." As they continued decoding, a pattern emerged that made Graham's blood run cold. The surnames mentioned in Thorne's journal, Henderson, Morrison, Blackstone, were the same names associated with the most prominent families in the current county leadership. Agnes confirmed what Graham was beginning to suspect. The corruption that had driven Thorne into hiding was still operating, passed down through generations like a family business. "Marcus Webb isn't just working for Blackstone Industries," Agnes said grimly. He's part of the same network that destroyed Ezekiel a century ago. They're still stealing, still destroying anything that threatens their control. The final decoded entries revealed the location of Thorne's most important hidden chamber, sealed behind a wall in the basement and accessible only through a combination that required both mathematical skill and knowledge of his personal history. But more importantly, the journal described what was hidden there. Original documents proving his innovations had been stolen, financial records showing how his wealth had been systematically appropriated, and evidence of a conspiracy that had cost him his life. That evening, as they prepared to search for Thorne's hidden chamber, Sheriff Morrison arrived with 2 deputies. Graham recognized Morrison from descriptions in the journal. He was the great-grandson of the sheriff who had helped drive Thorne from public view. Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the kind of swagger that came from wielding unchecked authority in a small community. His uniform was crisp and his badge polished, but his eyes held the calculating coldness Graham had seen in Marcus Webb. "Mr. Wilder," Morrison said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I've received complaints about disturbances at this property. Neighbors report strange lights, unusual sounds, and people coming and going at odd hours." Graham glanced around at the isolated property, noting that the nearest neighbors were over a mile away. "I wasn't aware we had any neighbors close enough to be disturbed." Morrison's expression didn't change. "There are also concerns about the structural integrity of this old house. The county has safety codes that need to be enforced, especially when a minor is involved." The threat was barely veiled, but Graham had learned enough from Thorne's journal to recognize the pattern. Pressure from law enforcement, questions about permits and safety codes, suggestions that they might be better off accepting Blackstone's offer. "The house is structurally sound," Graham said evenly. "I'm a licensed contractor, and I've done a thorough inspection." "That may be," Morrison replied, "but the county will need to conduct its own assessment. I'd hate for there to be any accidents." "While you're living here with your boy," Agnes stepped forward, her librarian's instinct for documentation overriding her fear of the sheriff's implied threats. "Are you conducting an official inspection, Sheriff Morrison? Because if so, you'll need proper warrants and advance notice as required by county procedure." Morrison's facade of politeness slipped slightly. "Miss Blackwood, I'd advise you not to interfere in official county business. Your position at the library depends on maintaining good relationships with the people who fund it." After they left, Graham found Caleb in the workshop, working on another complex mathematical sketch. But this time, his son wasn't alone. A translucent figure sat beside him at the workbench, a tall black man in a Victorian suit, his presence more suggestion than substance, but unmistakably real. The ghost of Ezekiel Thorne looked up as Graham entered, his eyes filled with a sadness that had transcended death. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from a great distance, hollow and echoing. "They're using the same methods," Thorne said, his image flickering like candlelight in a breeze. "The same corruption, the same threats, but this time we have something they don't expect." "What's that?" Graham asked, no longer surprised by supernatural conversations. Thorne smiled, and for a moment his image solidified, becoming as clear and present as any living person. "We have you," he said, "a father who will fight for his son's future, and we have Caleb, a boy who can see patterns they can't imagine." The ghost gestured toward Caleb's sketch, and Graham saw that his son had been drawing a map of the basement, complete with measurements and calculations that would lead them to the hidden chamber. But more than that, the boy had been working on something else, a plan for protecting what they found there, a strategy for ensuring that this time the truth would survive. As if summoned by Thorne's words, the mechanical calculator began spinning. Again, its gears processing new data. The display showed a countdown, not of time, but of opportunities. Each number represented a chance to act before Morrison and Webb could complete whatever legal maneuvers they were planning. "Tomorrow," Thorne said, his image beginning to fade. "Tomorrow, We end this. One way or another, the ghost vanished, leaving behind only the scent of ink and old paper, and the growing certainty that their real battle was just beginning. The hidden chamber opened at 3 in the morning, yielding to the combination Caleb had decoded from his father's mathematical sketches. Graham worked by flashlight while his son held the encrypted journal, both of them following Thorne's precise instructions for locating the concealed entrance behind what appeared to be a solid foundation wall. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity, a series of pressure points that had to be activated in a specific sequence based on mathematical constants Thorne had embedded throughout his coded writings. When the final stone was pressed, a section of the basement wall swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a chamber that had been sealed for nearly a century. The air that flowed out carried the scent of preserved paper and metal, as if time itself had been held in suspension. Graham's flashlight beam revealed a room perhaps 8 feet square, its walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves that held documents, mechanical devices, and strongboxes that gleamed despite their age. At the center of the chamber sat an ornate safe, its steel door decorated with intricate engravings that included mathematical formulas and geometric patterns. But it was what lay on top of the safe that made Graham's breath catch in his throat. A stack of legal documents tied with red ribbon, and beside them a letter addressed in Thorne's careful handwriting. To whoever finds this chamber, if you have come this far, you are the heir I hoped would someday arrive. Caleb moved past his father with the confidence of someone returning to familiar territory, and Graham realized with growing amazement that his son had been here before, not physically perhaps, but through some connection to Thorne's spirit that transcended normal understanding. The boy went directly to a specific filing cabinet and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. Graham opened the folder and found himself staring at papers that redefined everything he thought he knew about Ezekiel Thorne. These weren't just financial records or mathematical theories. They were patent applications, legal contracts, and business correspondence that revealed the true scope of what had been stolen from him. The first document was a patent application, dated 1919, describing a method and apparatus for mechanical calculation of complex financial projections. The diagrams showed detailed schematics for the very calculator they'd found in Graham's workshop, but more than that, they showed plans for an entire system of devices that could revolutionize banking, investment, and economic forecasting. The application had been rejected, not for technical reasons, but with a notation that made Graham's hands shake with anger. Applicant lacks the educational credentials and social standing necessary to support claims of such sophisticated innovation. But Thorne had been persistent. The next document was a revised application submitted through a white attorney with Thorne listed not as inventor, but as technical consultant. This version had been approved and the patent granted, not to Ezekiel Thorne, but to a consortium of businessmen who had never seen the inside of his workshop. The theft was documented in meticulous detail. Correspondence between the consortium members revealed how they had systematically appropriated Thorne's innovations, using his race as justification for claiming his work as their own. Letters from bank presidents, county officials, and business leaders showed a coordinated effort to drive him from public view while profiting from his genius. Most damning of all was a letter dated December 1923, signed by the original founders of what would eventually become Blackstone Industries. The Thorne problem has been resolved. His disappearance has been arranged to look like a voluntary departure. All documentation of his involvement in our financial innovations has been destroyed. The reputation of our consortium remains intact. Agnes gasped as she read over Graham's shoulder. They killed him, she whispered. They murdered him and stole his life's work. But Caleb had found something even more significant. In the ornate safe, which had opened to a combination based on the date of Thorne's birth, lay documents that proved his innovations were worth far more than anyone had imagined. Modern patent law had evolved to protect intellectual property across extended time periods, and Thorne's original applications, properly documented and dated, would still be valid. More importantly, the financial algorithms he had developed were not just historically significant, they were revolutionary by current standards. Computer analysis would later confirm that Thorne had independently discovered mathematical principles that modern artificial intelligence was only beginning to explore. His methods for predicting market trends, optimized for mechanical calculation, could be adapted to digital systems with extraordinary results. The final document in the safe was Thorne's will, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving his entire estate and all associated intellectual property to the family that restores Marrowgate House to its intended purpose as a center of learning and innovation. The will specifically stated that the heir must be someone who demonstrated both mathematical aptitude and moral character, criteria that Caleb clearly met. As Graham studied the legal documents, the supernatural activity in the chamber intensified. Books materialized on empty shelves, mechanical devices assembled themselves from component parts, and the temperature dropped until their breath misted in the frigid air. But this time, the ghostly presence felt different, not the sad, isolated spirit they'd encountered before, but something energized and hopeful. Ezekiel Thorne materialized in the chamber with greater clarity than ever before, his image solid enough to cast shadows in Graham's flashlight beam. He looked younger than in the portrait, perhaps in his 20s, with eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone on the verge of changing the world. "You found it," Thorne said, his voice clear and strong. "I've been waiting so long for someone who could see past the fear and find the truth." "The patents are still valid?" Graham asked. Thorne nodded. "More than valid. The mathematical principles I discovered are fundamental to systems your era calls artificial intelligence. The financial algorithms alone are worth millions in your modern economy." Agnes was studying the patent documents with growing excitement. "These aren't just historical curiosities," she said. "This is cutting-edge technology, just implemented through mechanical rather than digital systems. Any company that owned these patents would have a tremendous competitive advantage." "Which is why they killed me," Thorne said matter-of-factly, "and why they'll try to kill you if they discover what you found." As if summoned by his words, car doors slammed outside the house. Graham counted at least 6 vehicles, their engines still running as footsteps approached on the gravel drive. Through the basement windows, he could see flashlight beams sweeping across the grounds. "They're here," Thorne said urgently. "Morrison and Webb, with enough men to take what they want by force. They know you're close to something that threatens them." Graham grabbed the most important documents and stuffed them into a waterproof bag, while Caleb collected the mechanical devices that could serve as evidence of Thorne's innovations. Agnes took photographs of everything they couldn't carry, her librarian's instincts recognizing the historical importance of documenting the find. The pounding on the front door echoed through the house with official authority, followed by Morrison's voice. "County Sheriff, open up. We have a warrant to search these premises." Thorne's spirit flickered with agitation. "The warrant is fake," he said, "but they'll use it to justify whatever they find. You need to get those documents to someone who can expose the truth." "How?" Graham asked, looking around the sealed chamber. "They're surrounding the house." It was Caleb who provided the answer. Moving to what appeared to be a blank section of the chamber wall, he pressed a sequence of stones that Graham hadn't noticed. Another panel swung open, revealing a tunnel that led away from the house toward the forest. "I built it as an escape route," Thorne explained. "It leads to a cave system that connects to the old logging roads. You can reach the highway without being seen." The sound of splintering wood echoed from upstairs as Morrison's men forced their way into the house. Graham could hear them spreading out, searching rooms with the thoroughness of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Go," Thorne urged. "Take the documents, take my legacy, and make sure the world knows what they did. Make sure justice finally comes to Marrowgate House." As they entered the tunnel, Graham heard the basement door being forced open and flashlight beams beginning to probe the hidden chamber. But they had what they came for: evidence that would expose a century of corruption and restore recognition to a genius who had been murdered for the crime of excellence. Behind them, Thorne's spirit remained in the chamber, and Graham could hear his voice echoing through the tunnel. "Find David Chen, the civil rights attorney in the state capital. He specializes in historical injustices. He'll know what to do with what you've found." The tunnel was longer than Graham had expected, carved through solid rock with the same precision Thorne brought to all his work. It emerged in a natural cave, overlooking the valley with a clear view of the house and the vehicles surrounding it. From their hiding place, they could see Morrison's men ransacking the mansion, searching for the very documents now safely in Graham's possession. For the first time since Sarah's death, Graham felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: the certainty that they were going to win. David Chen's law office occupied the third floor of a restored brick building in the state capital, its windows offering a view of the courthouse where some of the most important civil rights cases in the region's history had been decided. Graham and Caleb arrived there at dawn, having spent the night in a roadside motel while Agnes made the introductory calls that would get them an emergency meeting with the attorney Thorne had recommended. Chen was a compact man in his 40s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of focused intensity that came from building a career on cases others considered impossible. His office walls displayed framed photographs of courthouse steps, protest marches, and clients whose faces told stories of injustice overcome through persistent legal action. Agnes Blackwood explained the basics over the phone, Chen said as they settled around his conference table. "But I need to see the evidence before I can assess what we're dealing with." Graham opened the waterproof bag and spread Thorne's documents across the polished wood surface: patent applications, business correspondence, financial records, and the forged legal papers that had transferred ownership of his innovations to the Blackstone Consortium. Chen's expression grew increasingly serious as he examined each piece of evidence, his trained eye recognizing the significance of what they'd discovered. "This is remarkable," Chen said finally. "These patents weren't just stolen. They became the foundation for an entire industry. The mathematical principles described here are still being used by major financial institutions, and the original holders never paid a cent in compensation to Thorne's estate." Agnes had brought additional research from the county archives, including death certificates, property transfers, and newspaper accounts from 1923 that painted a picture of systematic corruption. The same families that had destroyed Thorne continued to control significant aspects of the county's political and economic structure, passing their influence from generation to generation like inherited wealth. The current Blackstone Industries is directly descended from the original consortium, Chen noted, studying the corporate genealogy Agnes had compiled. Marcus Webb isn't just an employee. He's the great-nephew of one of the founders. This isn't just historical injustice, it's ongoing criminal enterprise. Caleb had been quiet during the adult conversation, but now he approached the conference table with a notebook he'd been filling with calculations during their escape from Marrowgate House. His mathematical sketches had grown increasingly sophisticated, showing not just Thorne's original algorithms, but extensions and improvements that demonstrated a remarkable understanding of the underlying principles. "Your son has an extraordinary gift," Chen observed, studying Caleb's work. "These calculations suggest he understands Thorne's methods intuitively. That's going to be crucial for establishing continuity of intellectual property," Chen explained. The legal strategy he was developing. The original patents had been fraudulently obtained, which meant they could be challenged and potentially restored to Thorne's estate. Under current intellectual property law, the damages for nearly a century of unauthorized use could amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. But more than money, success would mean public recognition of Thorne's contributions and legal acknowledgement of the conspiracy that had cost him his life. The challenge, Chen continued, is that we're going up against people with significant political influence and unlimited legal resources. Blackstone Industries has connections throughout the state government, and Sheriff Morrison represents law enforcement authority in your county. They'll fight this with everything they have. As if to underscore his point, Chen's phone rang with an urgent call from Agnes. Her voice was strained with fear as she reported that Morrison and his deputies had searched the library, confiscating her research files and questioning her about Graham and Caleb's whereabouts. The sheriff had made it clear that harboring fugitives, his characterization of their legal escape from the house, would result in serious consequences. "They're escalating," Chen said after ending the call, "which means we need to move fast before they can manufacture evidence or create legal complications that cloud our case." He outlined the immediate steps: filing for emergency protection of the Marrowgate House property, submitting patent challenges through federal intellectual property courts, and requesting investigation of Morrison's conduct by state authorities. But success would depend on their ability to present the evidence in a forum where Blackstone's influence couldn't reach. "We need media attention," Chen said. "Public scrutiny makes it harder for them to operate through backroom deals and political pressure. If we can get the story out, the full story of what was done to Ezekiel Thorne, it becomes much more difficult for them to continue the cover-up." That afternoon, they met with investigative journalist Sarah Martinez, who specialized in exposing historical injustices and their contemporary consequences. Martinez was intrigued by the story, but needed verification that went beyond the documents Graham had recovered. "The evidence is compelling," Martinez said, "but I need independent confirmation. The patents can be verified through federal records, but I need someone who can authenticate Thorne's mathematical work and confirm that the modern applications are really based on his innovations." The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Michael Harrison, a mathematics professor at the State University, had been researching the historical development of financial algorithms for a book he was writing about African American contributions to economic theory. Agnes had contacted him years earlier during her own research, and he had been looking for exactly the kind of evidence they'd discovered. Harrison arrived at Chen's office that evening, bringing with him computer simulations that demonstrated the practical applications of Thorne's work. When he saw the original documents and Caleb's extensions of the mathematical principles, his academic excitement was palpable. "This is revolutionary," Harrison said, his voice filled with awe. "Thorne wasn't just ahead of his time, he was working with concepts that we're only now beginning to understand. These algorithms, properly implemented, could transform financial forecasting. More importantly for their legal case, Harrison could prove that modern systems used by major banks and investment firms were directly based on principles Thorne had developed. The financial industry had been profiting from his innovations for decades without acknowledging their source or paying compensation to his estate. As they worked late into the evening, preparing evidence and planning legal strategy, Caleb made another remarkable discovery. Using Thorne's calculating principles, he had determined that the current value of the stolen intellectual property exceeded $10 million. A figure that took Chen's breath away when he calculated the potential damages. "If we can prove ownership and unauthorized use," Chen said, "this becomes one of the largest intellectual property theft cases in American history. But remember, we're not just fighting for money. We're fighting for recognition of a brilliant man who was murdered because of his race and his success." The next morning brought disturbing news. Morrison had obtained a court order declaring Graham an unfit parent, citing his residence in a structurally unsafe property and his alleged involvement in criminal activities related to the break-in. At Marrowgate House, the order authorized immediate custody of Caleb pending a full investigation. "It's a sham," Chen said angrily, "but it's a legal sham backed by a corrupt judge who owes his position to political connections. They're trying to separate you from Caleb and force you to abandon the case in exchange for your son's return." Graham felt rage building in his chest, the same helpless fury he'd experienced while watching Sarah waste away in a hospital bed, fighting enemies he couldn't see or touch. But this time, he wasn't powerless. This time, he had evidence, legal support, and the ghost of a murdered genius who had been waiting a century for justice. "What do we do?" Graham asked. Chen's smile was grim but determined. "We go to federal court. Civil rights violations supersede local authority, and once we establish federal jurisdiction, Morrison's corrupt local orders become meaningless." They had one advantage Morrison didn't expect. Thorne's spirit was still actively helping their cause. That night, as they prepared their federal filings, supernatural activity intensified throughout the lawyer's office. Documents organized themselves, mathematical proofs appeared on whiteboards, and the office computer began displaying financial calculations that confirmed Caleb's damage estimates. Dr. Harrison, witnessing the ghostly assistance with scientific fascination, began documenting the supernatural encounters as additional evidence of Thorne's continued involvement in protecting his intellectual legacy. "I've never believed in ghosts," Harrison admitted, "but I can't deny what I'm seeing. Whatever force is helping us understand these mathematical principles has an intelligence that transcends normal explanation." Agnes arrived the next morning with news that changed everything. Her continued research had uncovered Thorne's original will in the county probate records. The same will they'd found in his hidden chamber, but this copy bore official court seals and witness signatures that proved its authenticity. According to probate law, Chen explained, this will was never properly executed because Thorne's death was never officially established. Since he simply disappeared, his estate remained in legal limbo. But if we can prove he was murdered, the will becomes active, and everything he owned passes to his designated heirs. The legal implications were staggering. Not only would they recover the stolen patents, but they would inherit Marrowgate House, all of Thorne's financial assets that had been appropriated by the consortium, and accumulated interest on investments that had been growing for nearly a century. The total value could approach $50 million, Chen said quietly. But more importantly, it establishes legal standing to pursue criminal charges for murder, conspiracy, and ongoing fraud. As they prepared for what would be the most important court hearing of their lives, Graham felt Thorne's presence stronger than ever. The ghost appeared to him that night, no longer the sad, isolated spirit they'd first encountered, but a figure radiating determination and hope. "Tomorrow," Thorne said, "we end this one way or another. The truth will finally be heard." Graham nodded, thinking of Caleb sleeping peacefully despite the chaos swirling around them, dreaming perhaps of mathematical formulas and mechanical calculators. Whatever happened in court, his son would know that some fights were worth having, and that justice, however long delayed, was always worth pursuing. The battle for Ezekiel Thorne's legacy was about to begin. The federal courthouse in the state capital buzzed with activity as reporters, legal observers, and curious citizens gathered for what the media had dubbed the ghost patent case. Graham arrived with Caleb and their legal team to find a scene that resembled a historical reenactment more than a modern court proceeding. David Chen had assembled an impressive array of expert witnesses. Dr. Harrison to testify about the mathematical innovations, handwriting analysts to confirm document authenticity, and historians to provide context about racial discrimination in early 20th century patent law. But the star of their case was Caleb himself, whose intuitive understanding of Thorne's work would demonstrate the continuity of intellectual property that made their legal claims possible. Marcus Webb sat at the defendant's table with a team of corporate attorneys that filled 2 entire rows, their expensive suits and confident demeanor projecting the kind of institutional power that had dominated American business for generations. Behind them sat Sheriff Morrison, his presence a reminder that local authority still carried weight even in federal proceedings. Judge Patricia Williams was an African-American woman in her 60s whose appointment to the federal bench had come after a distinguished career prosecuting civil rights violations. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for legal manipulation and procedural games. "This is an extraordinary case," Judge Williams said as she opened the proceedings, "involving claims that span nearly a century and touch on some of the most troubling aspects of American legal history. We will proceed with careful attention to both historical justice and contemporary law." Chen began with a methodical presentation of the evidence, walking the court through Thorne's original patents, the fraudulent transfers to the Blackstone Consortium, and the documented conspiracy to steal his innovations. Each piece of evidence was authenticated by expert witnesses who testified that the mathematical principles described in Thorne's work were genuine, revolutionary, and still valuable in modern applications. Dr. Harrison's testimony was particularly compelling. Using computer simulations, he demonstrated how Thorne's mechanical algorithms could be adapted to digital systems, with results that exceeded anything currently available in the financial industry. The projected value of properly implemented Thorne patents reached into hundreds of millions of dollars. The defendant corporations have been using Dr. Thorne's innovations for nearly a century without acknowledgement or compensation, Harrison testified. This represents one of the largest cases of intellectual property theft in American history. Blackstone's attorneys responded with a strategy Graham recognized from Thorne's journal entries. They questioned whether a black man in 1919 could have developed such sophisticated mathematical concepts without assistance from white colleagues. Their expert witnesses suggested that Thorne had been at best a talented assistant to the true innovators whose names appeared on the fraudulent patents. The courtroom erupted when lead defense attorney Jonathan Sterling made the argument explicit. "Your Honor, we must consider the historical context. In 1919, it would have been highly unusual for someone of Dr. Thorne's background to possess the educational credentials necessary for such advanced mathematical work." Judge Williams's expression grew dangerously cold. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that Dr. Thorne's race disqualifies him from being recognized as the author of his own innovations?" "Not at all, Your Honor," Sterling backtracked quickly. "We're simply suggesting that the complexity of these mathematical principles suggests collaboration that isn't reflected in the historical record. It was at that moment that the supernatural assistance Chen had been hoping for manifested in the courtroom. The temperature dropped noticeably. Papers began rustling without any wind, and the courtroom's electronic equipment began displaying mathematical formulas that corresponded exactly to Thorne's original work. More dramatically, a device that had been sitting silent on the evidence table, one of Thorne's original mechanical calculators, suddenly began operating on its own. Its brass gears spinning and numerical displays showing complex calculations that addressed exactly the questions Sterling had raised. Judge Williams observed the supernatural activity with remarkable composure, her judicial experience apparently extending to phenomena beyond normal courtroom procedure. The record will reflect that physical evidence is demonstrating computational capabilities consistent with Dr. Thorne's documented innovations. Caleb, who had been sitting quietly throughout the morning's testimony, suddenly stood up and walked to the witness stand. Without being called to testify, he began speaking for the first time since his mother's death. his voice clear and strong as he addressed the court. "Dr. Thorne isn't gone," Caleb said simply. "He's been waiting in our house for someone who could understand his work. He taught me his methods because he wanted the truth to be known." The boy began writing mathematical equations on a whiteboard that had been set up for expert testimony, his small hands moving with confidence as he demonstrated principles that graduate students in mathematics would struggle to comprehend. The formulas, he wrote, were extensions of Thorne's original work, showing improvements and applications that proved genuine understanding rather than mere memorization. These equations show how Dr. Thorne's algorithms can predict market trends. "Better than any computer system," Caleb continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "The men who stole his work never understood what they had taken. They just knew it made them money." Dr. Harrison confirmed that Caleb's calculations were mathematically sound and represented genuine innovation built on Thorne's foundation. The demonstration was so compelling that even Blackstone's expert witnesses admitted they couldn't explain how a 12-year-old boy could have developed such sophisticated understanding without access to graduate-level mathematical training. Caleb returned to his seat. The mechanical calculator on the evidence table produced a strip of paper covered with calculations. Judge Williams examined the paper and announced that it contained precise financial projections showing the accumulated value of Thorne's stolen innovations. $10,147,000, a figure that matched Caleb's earlier estimates exactly. The afternoon session began with Agnes Blackwood taking the witness stand, her decades of research providing crucial context for the court's understanding of the historical conspiracy. She presented documents showing how the theft of Thorne's innovations had been systematically covered up, with official records altered, newspaper accounts suppressed, and witness testimony intimidated into silence. "This wasn't just intellectual property theft," Agnes testified, her librarian's precision lending authority to every word. "This was the deliberate erasure of a brilliant man's contributions to American innovation. They didn't just steal his work, they tried to steal his place in history, but it was her final piece of evidence that changed everything." From her research files, she produced a document that made the entire courtroom gasp. A confession letter, written in 1943 by Thomas Morrison, Sheriff Morrison's grandfather and one of the original conspirators. The letter, addressed to Morrison's son and marked, "To be opened only after my death," contained a detailed admission of the conspiracy against Thorne. The elder Morrison, apparently suffering from a crisis of conscience in his final years, had documented exactly how they had murdered Thorne and appropriated his wealth. "We told ourselves it was about maintaining order," Agnes read from the confession. "A black man with that much money and influence upset the natural balance of things. But the truth is, we were greedy and afraid. Afraid that if one of them could rise so high, what did that say about our own achievements? So we took everything he had built and claimed it as our own." The confession provided details that only someone involved in the conspiracy could have known: the location of Thorne's body, hidden in a remote section of the forest surrounding Marrowgate House, the names of all participants, and most damning of all, a description of how they had forged documents to transfer ownership of his patents and financial assets to the Blackstone Consortium. David Chen moved for an immediate recess to allow law enforcement to investigate the locations described in the confession. Judge Williams granted the motion, but the delay gave Blackstone's attorneys time to mount their final desperate defense. When court reconvened 2 hours later, Sterling had shifted to a new strategy, claiming that even if historical injustices had occurred, the statute of limitations had long since expired, and current property owners couldn't be held responsible for crimes committed by their predecessors. "Your Honor," Sterling argued. "While we deeply regret any historical wrongdoing, current law cannot retroactively punish contemporary business entities for actions taken by previous generations. Blackstone Industries is a modern corporation, with no legal connection to events that occurred a century ago." Judge Williams listened patiently, then asked a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Counselor, are you arguing that continued use of stolen intellectual property doesn't constitute ongoing criminal activity?" Before Sterling could answer, the courtroom's electronic systems began displaying financial records that showed exactly how Blackstone Industries had profited from Thorne's innovations year after year, decade after decade. The data appearing, as if generated by some invisible computer operator, demonstrated continuous and knowing use of the stolen algorithms throughout the company's history. Sheriff Morrison, who had been growing increasingly agitated as evidence mounted against his family's legacy, suddenly stood up and shouted, "This is all lies and supernatural nonsense. That house has been driving people crazy for generations, and now it's corrupting these proceedings." His outburst violated court decorum and revealed the desperation of the defense case. Judge Williams ordered him removed from the courtroom, but his words had an unexpected effect. They provided the perfect segue for Chen's final argument. "Your Honor," Chen said, rising to address the court, "Sheriff Morrison is absolutely correct about one thing. Marrowgate House has indeed been affecting people for generations, but not by driving them crazy, by preserving the truth that his family and their associates tried to bury." Chen presented Thorne's will, authenticated by handwriting experts, and verified against probate records, establishing Graham and Caleb as the rightful heirs to the stolen estate. The supernatural activity in the courtroom intensified as he spoke, with documents organizing themselves and mathematical proofs appearing on whiteboards as if written by invisible hands. "Dr. Ezekiel Thorne's spirit has been waiting nearly a century for justice," Chen continued. "His presence in that house wasn't a haunting, it was a vigil. He was protecting his legacy until the right family arrived, a family with the moral character and intellectual capability to restore his rightful place in history." The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harrison announced that the university's archaeology department had found human remains at the location described in Thomas Morrison's confession letter. Preliminary examination confirmed they belonged to a black male approximately 30 years old, with evidence of foul play consistent with the historical accounts. "We have found Dr. Thorne," Dr. Harrison testified solemnly. "His body was hidden in an unmarked grave, just as the confession described. He never left Marrowgate House. He was murdered on his own property and buried in secret." Judge Williams called for final arguments, and Chen's summation was brief but powerful. "This case represents everything wrong with American justice. A brilliant man murdered because of his race, his achievements stolen and claimed by his killers, and a conspiracy of silence that lasted a century. But it also represents everything right about American justice. The belief that truth will eventually prevail, that no injustice is too old to correct, and that the law exists to protect the innocent regardless of their color or status." Sterling's closing argument felt hollow by comparison, his corporate talking points about statute of limitations and procedural technicalities seeming petty against the weight of historical truth and supernatural confirmation. As Judge Williams retired to consider her verdict, Thorne's ghost appeared in the courtroom with greater clarity than ever before, visible to everyone present. He nodded once to Graham and Caleb, his expression peaceful for the first time since they had encountered him, then faded away with what looked unmistakably like a smile. Justice, it seemed, was finally within reach. 6 months after Judge Williams handed down her landmark ruling, Graham stood in the renovated great room of Marrowgate House, watching visitors explore the mansion that had been transformed from a haunted relic into a living monument to genius and perseverance. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been restored to their original brilliance, casting jeweled patterns across hardwood floors that gleamed with the warm patina of loving care. The court's decision had been comprehensive and devastating. To the defendants, Judge Williams had ruled that the theft of Thorne's intellectual property constituted ongoing criminal activity that nullified any statute of limitations defense. Blackstone Industries was ordered to pay $10.2 million in damages, the exact amount Thorne's calculating device had predicted, plus interest and legal fees that brought the total settlement to nearly $15 million. More importantly, the patents were restored to Thorne's estate, with Graham and Caleb recognized as his legal heirs under the terms of the will that had waited a century to be executed. Sheriff Morrison had been arrested on corruption charges, and a federal investigation had uncovered a network of historical document falsification that reached back generations. But the victory meant more than money or legal vindication. The mansion had become the Ezekiel Thorne Center for Mathematical Innovation, a combination museum, research facility, and educational center that welcomed visitors from around the world. Caleb, now 13, and speaking regularly, served as the center's youngest docent, explaining his ancestors' mathematical principles with an enthusiasm that made complex equations accessible to visitors of all ages. The boy had grown into his role as Thorne's heir with remarkable grace. His mathematical abilities, nurtured by supernatural tutoring and his father's practical wisdom, had attracted attention from universities and research institutions. But Caleb remained grounded in the simple truth that his gifts came with responsibilities: to honor Thorne's memory, to help others understand the beauty of mathematical truth, and to ensure that genius was never again silenced by prejudice or fear. Agnes Blackwood had been appointed as the center's head curator, her decades of research finally receiving the recognition it deserved. She had published a comprehensive biography of Thorne that became a bestseller, bringing his story to audiences far beyond academic circles. The book's success had funded additional research into other forgotten innovators, part of a broader effort to restore lost voices to the historical record. Graham found his own purpose transformed by their journey. His handyman skills had evolved into expertise in historical restoration, and his workshop in the mansion's carriage house had become a training center where young people learned traditional craftsmanship alongside modern techniques. The irony wasn't lost on him that in saving Thorne's legacy, he had discovered his own. The supernatural activity that had guided their discovery had largely ceased after the court victory, but occasionally Graham would sense Thorne's presence during quiet moments in the library or workshop. The ghost no longer appeared with the desperate urgency of the early days, but rather as a benevolent guardian, ensuring that his home remained a place of learning and justice. Mrs. Henderson, now 81, had moved into the mansion's renovated guest quarters, where she served as the unofficial grandmother to visitors and volunteer staff. Her presence provided continuity between the house's troubled past and its hopeful future, and her afternoon tea sessions in the restored parlor had become legendary among regular visitors. The mechanical calculator that had served as their key to understanding Thorne's work occupied a place of honor in the mansion's main exhibit hall. Still functional after more than a century, it continued to demonstrate the principles Thorne had discovered, its brass gears and intricate mechanisms drawing admiration from engineers and mathematicians who marveled at the sophistication of pre-digital computation. Dr. Harrison had established a research partnership between the center and the university, focusing on applications of Thorne's algorithms to modern problems. The financial prediction methods that had made Thorne wealthy in the 1920s were proving remarkably effective when adapted to contemporary markets, generating revenue that helped fund the center's operations and educational programs. But perhaps The most meaningful transformation was in Caleb himself. The silent, grieving boy who had arrived at the mansion 18 months earlier had become an articulate young man with a clear sense of purpose and identity. He spoke often of his mother, Sarah, whose memory had been honored rather than replaced by their connection to Thorne's legacy. "She would have loved this place," Caleb told visitors during tours, gesturing toward the restored gardens where Sarah's favorite flowers now bloomed in carefully tended beds. "She always said that the best way to honor people who are gone is to keep their dreams alive." On this particular afternoon, Graham was preparing for a special ceremony, the dedication of Thorne's rebuilt monument in the mansion's formal gardens. The original gravestone had been destroyed by the conspirators who murdered him, but the new memorial, carved from black granite and inscribed with his most elegant equations, would ensure that his contributions were never again forgotten. Guests gathered for the dedication. Graham noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd, Marcus Webb, looking older and more worn than when they had first encountered him, approached with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Wilder," Webb said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for my family's role in what happened to Dr. Thorne. What my great-uncle and the others did was inexcusable." Graham studied the man who had once threatened their home, noting the genuine remorse in his expression. "Apologies are a start," Graham replied, "but the real test is what happens next. What are you going to do to make things right?" Webb nodded, having expected the challenge. "I have established a scholarship fund for underprivileged students studying mathematics and engineering. It's funded by my personal assets, everything I inherited that came from the original theft. I can't undo history, but I can try to ensure it doesn't repeat itself." As the dedication ceremony began, Graham felt Sarah's wedding ring against his chest, a tangible reminder of the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had bought a haunted mansion for $1 and discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden behind the greatest fears. He had learned that ghosts aren't always malevolent spirits seeking to frighten the living. Sometimes they're guardians of truth, waiting for the right people to arrive and set things right. Caleb stepped forward to unveil the memorial, his voice strong and clear as he read the inscription, "Dr. Ezekiel Thorne, 1867–1923, mathematical genius, visionary innovator, guardian of truth. His legacy lives on in everyone who believes that knowledge belongs to all humanity." As the covering fell away, a warm breeze stirred the garden, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and the whisper of leaves that sounded almost like applause. In that moment, Graham could have sworn he heard Thorne's voice one final time, carried on the wind. "Thank you for bringing me home."